our Honorable Chairman, Mr. J. Satish Kumar Sir, and Vice Chairman, Dr. Vishambar, Madam Chairman, to this webinar. And I extend my pleasure to welcome our guest speakers for today's webinar, Dr. Ramesh Pola and Mrs. Simani from Kasturiba Medical College. And I also welcome our beloved Dean Professor Dr. Shanmugam Sir, Medical Superintendent Sir, Professor Dr. Mohan Sir, Vice Principal Madam, Professor Dr. Usha Madam, Deputy Medical Superintendent Professor Dr. Ilango, Controller of Examination Professor Dr. PMS Sir, and Medical Director, our beloved Professor Dr. Dhanasegar for today's webinar. I also extend my warm welcome to all faculty from Annapurna Medical College and Hospital and other medical colleges and our students, CRIs. I welcome you all. Now I request our beloved Dean to say few words.
Good afternoon to one and all. Respected Chairman and Madam Chairman, our Vice Chairman, who is beginning on this successful webinar. He helped us to conduct a very successful seminar webinar. I'm really thankful to our Chairman, who has taken a keen interest in academic activities in our institution. Respected Medical Superintendent Dr. Mohan, respected Vice Principal Dr. Usha, respected Academic Officer Dr. Dhanasegaran, respected Professor and HOD of Community Medicine, other professors of Naeem and Ibrahim and Dr. Indra and all other department people of Community Medicine for organizing such an important topic like protocol preparation. This is a very important in every aspect of our life. Any function, any teaching, or any program, or any organization, the protocol is very important. That too is very important for research activities. Research activities, the protocol preparations and the dissertation students, these are a very important thing. I think they throw light on this protocol preparation, the speakers. I thank the speakers, Dr. Ramesh Pola and Mrs. Himani for accepting our department invitation and coming and speaking in this webinar. I thank you very much for accepting our invitation and coming over here. And congratulate once again the Department of Community Medicine to organize such a wonderful and important thing everyone should know. And if you know that, you will be very successful in organizing anything, even in the research activity. So I think it is a very useful one, and all the delegates who are taking part in this will enjoy the fruits of this lecture, and congratulate all of you, and thank you for giving an opportunity.
Thank you very much, sir. Now I request our beloved Medical Superintendent, Sir Dr. Mohan, to say few words.
Good afternoon to all. On behalf of Annapurna Medical College and Hospital, I thank our Honorable Chairman, Madam Chairman, and Vice Chairman for encouraging us for the serial of more webinars, and our respected our Dean also, and our Vice Principal, and I especially thank to the HOD of Community Medicine and all the professors, faculties, Professor Muhammad Ibrahim, Dr. S.P. Priyadarsini, Associate Professor, and Professor Dr. Dhanasegaran, and all the other members of the Community Medicine Department, because they are very keen and they are conducting serial of webinars regarding biomedical research. It is useful for not only the undergraduate students, postgraduate students, house surgeons, and even for faculty also. So it's a very wonderful system they are following, and it's a they are the guy. Congratulate all the guest speakers and welcome all the guest speakers. They are renowned and they are all well academician and research oriented. Dr. Ramesh Mola, MD, and Mrs. Imani of my MSc Biostatics uh, for this wonderful uh, ECME program webinar. Uh, I, I wish all this webinar a good success. Thank you, one and all. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, sir. Now I request Dr. Priyadarshini, very eminent speaker, very eminent associate professor of our department, to introduce the guest speaker, Dr. Ramesh Hola.
Good afternoon to one and all. It's been a great pleasure for me to introduce one of the speakers for today's webinar, Dr. Ramesh Kola, who is working as Associate Professor in the Department of Community Medicine, Karnataka, Kasura Medical College, Bangalore, Karnataka, who has had vast teaching experience for over 10 years. He did his MBBS at Father Pulla Medical College, Bangalore, Karnataka in the year 2008, and he did his MD at Kempekoda Institute of Medical Sciences, Bangalore in the year 2012. He has been associated with various public health activities, which includes he is a district team member for rapid appraisal of district level preparedness and performance of health system regarding management of COVID-19 cases, and he is one of the member of the board of studies, and he is also the joint coordinator of voluntary services organization at Manipal University. He has won many awards and honors, and he has got the Good Teacher Award in the year 2014 at KMC. And he has got Young Scientist Award by the Association for Prevention and Control of Rabies in India at APCR in the year 2018. And he has also been the investigator for various research projects, which was funded by ICMR. And he has also published over 89 research papers as principal author and co-author as well. He has also guided short-term student projects, which was funded by ICMR. And he has also presented many papers in state level and national level conferences. He has also been the resource person for various programs, which includes clinical supply of equine rabies immunoglobulins at recent advances in rabies. With this brief outline, today we are here to listen and learn on the structure of a protocol. I am sure that the session is going to be very interesting and informative one. It is all welcome Dr. Ramesh Kola. We welcome you, sir.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Good afternoon, Dr. Ramesh Kola. Can you hear?
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. Thank you for the introduction. It is my privilege to, first of all, I can thank the Department of Community Medicine, Annapurna Medical College, for inviting me to speak on the structure of protocol. And it is my personal thanks to Dr. Somasundaram, sir, for inviting and involving Department of Community Medicine, Kasura Medical College, Bangalore. The two speakers from our department will be delivering lecture on structure of a protocol and the sample size calculation. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you. Now we can.
You can proceed.
You can proceed, Doctor.
You can proceed, sir.
Okay, okay, sir. Okay. Hello. Sir, can you see the slide?
Yes, yes.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, sir. Without further delay, I'm audible, right?
Yes.
You are audible, sir.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Proceed, sir.
Okay, thank you, sir. So once again, I thank Department of Community Medicine, Annapurna Medical College, Salem, for giving me an opportunity to present the structure of protocol. I think in the initial address, Dean sir only told the protocol is very important, no matter whether it is a household function or a public function or a college function. So every time we have to have a proper protocol in order to have a without any hindrance in the activity. So it is true for the research also. We have to have a the robust protocol in order to have a proper result outcome, and the protocol is very much essential whenever you are sending a proposal to the funding agencies, no matter it is small institutional grant or the national grant or the international grant. Without proper protocol it won't get accepted. So we have to have a robust protocol. So in that context I will tell you the broad outline of protocol, what and all things should be there in the protocol. And I will, in the last part of my presentation, I will tell about the mandatory registration and can we publish the protocol in your published article on the journal articles. So we will think only the results or the final report only can be published in the journal, but nowadays even the protocol also can be published in the reputed journals. So this, I think most of these researchers will be knowing what are the basic steps in the research. So first and foremost, you have to have a proper research question. So only if you have a research question, based on that, you can have a review of literature, and based on that, you can develop a proper methodology, and based on that, you can have a proper results outcome. So first step, first and foremost in the research project is identify the research question, conduct the extensive review of literature, frame the hypothesis based on the review of literature you have done, develop the study design in order to suit your objective and in order to meet your objectives, complete the research, and then analyze the data using various statistical software, and ultimately you have to generate the conclusion. The research steps doesn't stop here. So after getting the conclusion, you have to publish your report or the protocol in the reputed scientific journals. So just by doing the research just for the PG thesis purpose doesn't serve the purpose. Now if you, even if you see the National Medical Commission, they have given the guidelines, the postgraduate thesis, it has to be sent for publication at the time of giving PG exam. So that has been made mandatory. In addition to poster presentation and the oral presentation, the one publication has to be sent for publication at the time of PG exam. So we have to, whenever the research you do, there's nothing called a big research or a small research. Whatever research you have done, whether it has followed the proper methodological things, then we have to aim for publication. Maybe in good journal or maybe in one of the index journal, it has to get published. Then only the people or the policymaker, they will get benefit out of the research what you have done at your institution level. So next, the first and the important step in conducting a research is identification of the research problem, or you have to develop a research question. What is the problem? Why are you planning to do this type of research in your institution or at the community level? So that has to be identified at the beginning. So these can be classified, or these are the few important parameters to be considered whenever you are identifying a research question. It should be feasible, it should be interesting, it should be novel, it should be ethical, and it should be needs or to the patient going to treat. So some high fund molecular or genetic test which is not feasible at the institution level, those research question you're not supposed to take it. Maybe the premier institution, they may be in a position, they are in a position to handle those microbiological or the biotechnological component. So at your institution level, whichever is feasible, that can be taken up for the research purpose, and it should be interesting and it should be novel. If the particular aspect of your research objective, if there are plenty of literatures are available, plenty of research publications are available on the same topic, there is no point in doing further research. You have to identify the knowledge gap which has been identified in the previously published article. Based on that, you have to frame your research question. And you should be ethical, all the ethical principles. I think the last month only you had a overview of ethical aspects in the research. In that, they would have discussed about the importance of ethical aspects in the research, and it should be relevant to the community. So, or to the patiental needs, whatever is required for the community or whatever is required for the day-to-day clinical management, those topics you have to take into account whenever you are conducting a or whenever you are identifying a proper research question. So it is nothing but finer, feasible, it should be interest, it should be novel, it should be ethical, and it should be relevant. The protocol should start with a clear and precise formulation of the research question. It is good to practice to write this in the form of a question, not as a statement. So here, I think those postgraduate students who are attending this session, please make it a habit whenever you are sending a protocol, maybe for thesis or for the any research grant, identify the research question and write it in the protocol. It should be in the form of question mark, not in the form of statement. So at least those who are reviewing your protocol, maybe the funding agencies like national, international funding agencies, they will come to know what is the research question you are going to do. Because usually we won't write the research question straight away. We'll start with introduction, we will write the objectives, and then we'll write about the methodological aspects or the review of literature. But it is good practice to write what is a research question, literature, then write the introduction, and then based on the review, based on the research question what you have identified, frame your objectives. All the objectives need not be reflected in your research question. So at least the main objective of your study, that should be reflected in your research question. So it is not vice versa. You have to develop research question first. Based on that, you have to frame your objectives. So when you're writing a protocol in future, please make it a habit to write a research question at the beginning of the protocol. So good or poor research ultimately depends upon how best you have chosen the research question. If you have chosen the well apt or which is a relevant research question, then obviously your methodology will be strong, and whatever results you are going to get, that will be more valid, and that will give a power to your study, and that will get published in good high impact factor journals. So everything bottoms down to the research question what you have identified at the beginning of your research journey. The question should be well understood and the problem should be well defined. If the question is hurried just for the sake of thesis, if you do a research question and identify some research question, the proceeding in an orderly fashion may be difficult and may produce unreliable results. So having a proper research question is the crucial step in formulating the protocol. So how are you going to frame the research question? So you might have, because of your UG experience or early career experience, you might have experienced so many things, and you might be thinking, why this particular disease is more common in Tamil Nadu? Why asthma is more, childhood asthma is more common in Tamil Nadu? Now, hypothetically, I'm giving the example. And why the mortality because of dengue is more common in this part of Chennai? So these are the different types of research questions based on your personal experience, based on your clinical experience, you might get. So based on that, you can frame your research question, or by going through the various literature. If you're interested in studying about diabetes or hypertension or cervical cancer, when you are studying so many literature related to diabetes and hypertension, you will come to know, okay, this aspect of diabetes or this molecular aspect of hypertension or this aspect of the risk factors or the associations or the mortality determinants of cervical cancer is not studied. So these, based on the literature such, you can identify a narrow area, and based on that you can frame your research question. Ideas from others. So usually the senior faculty in the department at the professor level or your thesis guide, they will give certain idea. They will give some abstract ideas. Based on that, you have to develop concrete concept, and based on that, you have to have the proper research question. So these are the various sources from where you can get the research question, and this is the first input for your research journey. And based on this, you have to develop your protocol. So this is about, once you identified a proper research question, then you have to have a proper the structuring. So it has to be in the paper format. Ideally, it has to be properly formatted, and it has to be submitted to Institution Ethics Committee or for the national or international funding agencies. So these are the few basic steps of a protocol: title and the investigator. We will go one by one: introduction, review of literature, objectives, materials and methods, ethical considerations, limitations, references, and any annexures or the appendices if you are having, that can be annexed at the end of your protocol. So all these steps I think once again I stress most of the protocol when it comes for the review, so they won't follow this robust to the subheadings. You have to have these subheadings, and below these subheadings, write explicitly the where you are going to do the study, who is your sample size, sampling techniques, inclusion criteria, exclusion criteria. Everything should be written properly, and it should be written as a separate subheadings: title, introduction, review of literature, objectives, because each section has got its own importance. You cannot skip one section. You have to have all the section in order to have a concrete protocol. And if there is any lacuna in this protocol, even though your research question might be good, even though your objectives might be good, but if you have not followed a proper guidelines of writing a protocol, then when it is sent for the funding agencies, straight away they can reject your proposal without going in detail about your objectives. So take a lead, even though you might have taken a lot of time for developing a research question, but you have to spend some time in order to have a proper word format of your research protocol. It should look neat, no spelling mistake should be there, and the grammatically it should be correct, and the whatever the alignment, the font size, everything matters. So when it goes for the review, so it should be pleasant to the reviewer, whoever sees your protocol. If it is not properly formatted and the font size are different, and if it is in italics, and some if it is not properly formatted, then straight away it can go for the rejection. So you should have a proper formatting, and I think you have to spend some time whenever you are writing a protocol or whenever you are typing a protocol before sending it for project review or before sending it for publication. So first and foremost is title and investigator, I told you. So the short and informative title should be there. So convey the main objective, population, and if possible, study design. So here I will stress, so it can vary. So your protocol and your finally, when you are sending it for publications, so the title can vary. So at the time of protocol, don't use the question mark sort of title for your thesis protocol, or when you're sending it for a proposal for the budget. But when you're sending it for publication, you can have a question mark form of your title. So that is the important thing for the PG thesis. Usually they will expect your protocol, the title should be straightforward, one sentence should be there, no question mark, or the explanation marks, all those things should be there in your project title. And you should convey the main objectives. You might be having 3 to 4 objectives in your protocol, but the important objectives should be addressed in your title. And in whom you are going to do the study. Are you going to do the study among adult pregnant mothers, or are you going to do the study among the pediatric age group, or are you going to do the study among diabetic patients or people living with HIV/AIDS? That has to be specified in your title. And if possible, try to include the study design. So if you're doing any cross-sectional study, I don't feel it has to be reflected in your title. But definitely, if you're doing a randomized control trial, so definitely that, because that study design itself has got a better hierarchy of evidence. If you see the hierarchy of evidence, systematic review and meta-analysis comes first, and then comes randomized control trial. So whenever you are doing a systematic review or a randomized control trial, that should reflect in your title. Cross-sectional study, it is up to you. Based on the length of your title, you can modify whether to include cross-sectional study into the title or not. But randomized control trial or cohort study, or if you are doing a systematic review, that should be a part of your study title. So introduction. So after, when you are writing a proper title, a catchy title or a self-informatory title, and then you have to have a robust introduction. So provide the logical and the scientific justification why you have chosen this study. Describe precisely the magnitude and the quantum of knowledge available regarding the problem. Identify the gaps and controversies in the existing knowledge, and should be as brief as possible. So usually, whenever you are writing the introduction, so whenever you are referring so many literatures, you should identify what is already known in this particular field. For example, if you are doing a study among dengue or malaria, you should know what aspect of dengue or what clinical patterns or what the risk factors or the determinants of mortality for dengue is already known from the literatures. So that has to be specified at the beginning. And any knowledge gap, so because you have to give justification or the rationale why you have chosen of this study. So any knowledge gap. So the third bullet point, identify the gap. It is nothing but knowledge gap. Certain, whenever you're writing a proposal, usually they will ask, what is the knowledge gap identified in your proposal? So that has to be a separate section. that can vary from one funding agency to another funding agency, but you have to identify what is the knowledge gap, what is already known in that particular field, what is unknown. So how are you going to address that knowledge gap? That has to be written as a last part of your introduction as a rationale for your study. So then you have to have a proper literature search or the review of literature, how much the same or similar research problem has been studied previously, to understand the limitation in those studies, to critically assess the required modification, which would provide some new knowledge. So the robust review of literature you have to do, so that what is already known in that particular field, that has to be written properly. It can be, sometimes they will tell it should be written in the form of tabular form, or it can be written in the form of bullet points as a separate paragraph. The purpose of the study, where it has been done, and what was the main conclusion drawn from that study, and what is the main limitation from that study. That has to be specified clearly when you are writing a literature review. So once you have made the review of literature properly, then you should know you have to frame the objectives, study objectives. You know the research question, you have done thorough review of literature, you know the knowledge gap, and based on that, you have to frame your objectives. So one should be able to achieve it within the reasonable time. It should be simple, clear, specific, and measurable. Number of objectives should be limited. So don't be under the impression that if you have got around 7 to 8 objectives, that is better rather than having one objective. No, as long as your research question is considered, if it is going to fulfill by the one objective, then no problem. You can go ahead with one objective itself for your funding agency or for the IEC clearance. If you have got a broad research question which has to be addressed, which can be addressed by 3 to 4 questions, then you have around 4 to 5 objectives. So as long as that all depends upon your research question, how specific is your research question or how broad is your research question. If the research question itself is very broad, then I think you have to have the many more objectives. So there is something called SMART. Objectives should be always SMART. That is not, it should be specific. S stands for specific. M stands for measurable at your institutional level. A stands for achievable, R stands for reliable, and T stands for time bound. You cannot aim for a project which lasts for more than 3 years or 4 years. Your entire thesis duration itself will be around 1 to 1.5 years. By the second year, you have to finish your thesis. So whenever you are framing your research question or whenever you are framing your objectives, keep this in mind. So it should be time bound and it should be as specific as possible, and it should be measurable based on the feasibility aspect of it at your institutional level or at the community level. It should be feasible and it should be measurable and it should be achievable from the time bound, and it should be reliable. So all these should be keep in your mind. So it is better to write your objectives, and once again you see whether it will fulfills all these criteria, and give it to your friends or the seniors or the peer reviews, so that they will also go through it and they will also give from their experience. They will give the feedback or the critical comments, and based on that you can modify your objectives. Because once the objectives are framed and once it has been sent for the institutional ethics committee for the clearance, and once it has been approved, then it is not possible for you to change the objectives. Then even if you're changing the objectives, then you have to again, as amendments, you have to give to ethical committee, you have to give the justification why you have changed. It's a long procedure. So it is better to discuss with your seniors and discuss with your peer groups, so that the objectives, whatever you have framed, that should be sound and that should be very specific before submitting to institutional ethics committee for approval. Next comes to the methodological section. So this is considered as the heart of your protocol. So most of your funding agencies, they are concentrated on the objectives and the methodological aspect. So you have to give importance to introduction and review of literature, but as a reviewer, they may not go in detail about the introduction or the review of literature, what you have done. So they will look into the methodological aspect, how you are going to perform this study or how you are going to implement this study. So based on that, they will judge whether this project has to be funded or not. So first and foremost, the first step in writing the methodology is study setting. That is where you are exactly planning to do the study. Are you planning to do the study in the community level, or are you planning to do the study at the hospital level or at the OPD level? That has to be clearly specified in the study setting. Study design, that again depends upon the research question. So are you planning to do a observational study, or are you planning to do a analytical cross-sectional study, or a descriptive cross-sectional study, case control study, quad study, RCT? So everything has to be specified in the study design. Study population, who is your study population, their inclusion criteria, exclusion criteria, everything has to be written when you are writing about this study population. Sample size, that again depends upon the research question what you have chosen. Are you going to calculate the proportions, or are you going to see the difference between the means? So that will be taken in detail in the next class, the next session. So Himani will be addressing about that. And whenever you are calculating the sample size, that also depends upon the study design what you have chosen. So the same sample size cannot be used for the case control, and it cannot be used for the cross-sector study. So all those things depends upon the study design what you have chosen for fulfilling your objectives. Sampling, so once the sample size has been achieved, how are you going to recruit those sample? Are you going to use the probability method of sampling, or are you going to use the non-probability method of sampling? So that has to be addressed in the protocol. Study duration, what is your study duration from the date of submission of protocol to ethics committee till how long you are going to do the data analysis and the final collection of your data. So data collection methodology, so that is nothing but how are you going to collect the information? Are you going to collect the information through the proforma, like interview technique, or are you going to collect by the self-administered questionnaire? Are you going to use the open-ended questionnaire or the closed-ended questionnaire? That itself is a separate session, the tool for data collection. So it is an interview technique or the questionnaire based study, whether questionnaire is the self-administered questionnaire, or whether it is considered as a are you going to interview the participant and then you are going to fill the proforma, or are you going to collect the information from the medical record section, that is like from the patient clinical case sheet, whatever is there in the medical record section, from there you are retrieving the information. So everything has to be written clearly in the data collection tool or the tool for data collection. So last step is about the data management and the statistical analysis. How are you going to manage the data? Are you going to use any statistical software? Which version you are going to use? And it is licensed by, for example, if you're using SPSS 25.0, IBM Corporation, New York, everything has to be written specifically from which organization you are going to use that software, which is a licensed version, depending upon your the college agreement, the college, whichever the college, the latest license the college is having, that version has to be specified in your protocol. And which software you are going to use for calculating the statistical test, for calculating the p-value, so that has to be categorically specified in the data management and statistical analysis. So study design, I told you already. So again, that depends upon your research question, and it depends upon your objective. And based on that, you have to choose the proper study design, whether it is observation study or it may be experimental study. So it explains the method that will be used to collect and analyze the data. It includes time frame to conduct the study. So whenever you're having the subject selections, I told you, you have to have a eligibility criteria, inclusion criteria, and exclusion criteria. So if you're planning to do a study on dengue patients, are you going to include all the dengue patients, or are you going to include only the dengue patients with hemorrhagic syndrome, only those patients you are going to include? So everything has to be categorically specified in the inclusion and exclusion criteria. Description of the recruitment mechanism and discussion of the recruitment feasibility. So those things has to be, how are you going to enroll the patients for your particular project or for your dissertation or thesis. So that has to be written clearly in the subject selection and the definition. But if you are using some operational definition for a particular condition, it is nowhere defined in the previous literature. So that operational definition of a particular condition. So according to you, what do you mean by mild? According to you, what do you mean by moderate? For your study purpose, that has to be specified in this heading of your protocol. Sample size, I won't go in detail, so that will be dealt in the next class. The sample size and the statistical power, specify the assumptions and provide tables of sample size and the power calculation, and how many you want to go, how many you are going to recruit the subject for your project or for your thesis. So data collection methodology, I told you how exactly you're going to collect the information from the study subjects. Are you going to interview them, or are you going to distribute the questionnaire them, or are you going to look into their case record form and getting the information from them? So that has to be clearly specified. How are you going to collect the data from the study participants for your research purpose? So data collection methods, definitions, and the measurements, precise definition of all the terms. So here, if you are using some operational definition, again, for this purpose, you have to write it here. What is the operational definitions used for your laboratory diagnosis or for the clinical diagnosis? All those things should come here. Consideration of the pilot testing for the methods and the instruments, discussing the validity and the reliability of the definitions proposed. For example, if you are using a questionnaire, there is something called content validation, criterion validation, because straight away, if it's a standard questionnaire, for example, if you are using a quality of life from the WHO BREF questionnaire, if you are using, so directly you can download it and it is open to use and you can use that questionnaire. But if we are not using the standard questionnaire, if you have developed your own questionnaire, then it has to be validated. The content validation and the criterion validation has to happen by giving the questionnaire to the subject experts. And then there is something called statistical measures are there. Based on that, you have to validate your questionnaire. Then only once it is validated, it can be administered to study participants. And but if you are using any other data collection tool which is not freely available or which is not freely licensed to use for the research purpose, you have to get the approval from the particular the corresponding author or the first author from that particular article journal. So you have to write to them and you have to request them. You are going to use the same questionnaire for your research purpose, and only when they give permission, then only you can go ahead with using that particular questionnaire. Otherwise, ethics committee will ask, have you taken any permission from the author, or since it is a copyrighted one, have you taken permission from them to use the questionnaire in the Chennai or in the Tamil Nadu settings? So you have to ask it, you have to mail it to them and get the response from them, and that can be submitted to ethics committee saying that you have got the permission from the author to use this questionnaire in your study purpose. Sometimes the ethics committee may not ask. You can go ahead with the data collection, but once you are sending it for publication, for example, if you use this questionnaire, then they will ask, since it is not open source questionnaire, have you taken permission? And if so, then give the appropriate proof for that. At that time, if you're not having the proof, then it may not be accepted in the publication and it can reject it from there. So it is not ethical to use someone's else questionnaire without getting the approval or without getting consent from him. So it's always better to go for the standard question. If it is just, then it is find out whether it is can be openly used or not. If it cannot be used, get the appropriate consent from the author, and then you can use it for your research purpose. So data management and analysis, the last part of the protocol, it is the procedures for conduct coding and the data entry, which software you are using, formal hypothesis testing, and examples of data presentation and comparison, depending upon your objectives and the research question, which statistical test you are going to use. The qualitative data, how are you going to manage? Quantitative data, how are you going to manage? Categorical data, how you are going to manage? Whether you are using any regression techniques, whether you are going to use any inferential statistics, all those things has to be clearly written in the data management and analysis. So it is better to write strengths and limitations whenever you are sending a proposal for funding agencies. It should be comprehensive, have to make the study design, and any issues regarding your the objectives or regarding your study methodology, that has to be written clearly. So it is better to be open, saying that there is no perfect protocol. You should have some limitations, and you can add because of budgetary constraints or because of time constraints and because of infrastructural constraints, what is not able to achieve in your study. So that is better to be written at the beginning itself when you are sending a proposal for funding agencies. Provide a section on the particular strength of the study design. So if you have got any strength, for example, if you are using cohort study, randomized controlled study, so that study design itself is a major strength. So that you can highlight what is the study design you are using, and that can be highlighted in your protocol, saying that this is the study design you are going to use, and that give a better evidence when compared to other observational studies. So this is about the project outlines and the GNAT chart you have to write it. This section, ethical issues, the expected hazards and the benefits, and you have to adhere to the International Declaration of the Helsinki, and the rationale and justification of the research, responsibility for the liability of injury, how participants are informed about the study, and how participants give consent for the enrollment. Everything has to be written under the ethical consideration. So I won't go in detail here. Because ethical aspects in the research has been dealt in the last month. So, but you have to have a separate sections of ethical consideration, whether there is any, especially true when you're doing a randomized control trial, involving a drug trial or the vaccine trial. So you have to write any risk to the patient, how are you going to take the informed consent, and if there is any adverse drug reactions, how we are going to manage that. So everything has to be specified in the ethical consideration. Overall project management. So you have to write what is the timeline for the project. So usually we will write it in the form of NAT chart. So when are you going to do the pilot study, and when are you going to recruit the subjects, and how much time it will take for the data collection, and how much time it will take for the follow-up of the procedures and data checking and the statistical analysis, whether you are doing any internal quality assurance or the external quality assurance. So that has to be specified here. Reporting to the participants, community, academic community, how are you going to disseminate the information? Are you going to publish it, or are you going to present it in a scientific gatherings? Everything has to be written explicitly in your GNAT chart or the overall project management. So this is one example how you are supposed to write it in the form of months, how many months you take for each of these steps. And for any proposal, no matter whether it is your thesis or any project, when you're going to send it for publication, you have to write it in the form of GNAT chart, how much time it will take for fulfilling each of these subheadings: preparation of protocol, submission of the ethics committee, recruitment of the research assistant, how much time it will take for the pilot study, data collection, data entry, data analysis, and report writing and submission. So the at the end of your protocol, you have to attach the investigators' roles and responsibilities, and you have to have their CV of the entire research team. So define here the role of each investigator who play a role in the study and what is his responsibilities. Determine best here the authorship of any publication. So it is a better thing here, because of lot of misunderstanding will happen when it is goes for a publication. So it is better to have the entire research team at the beginning of the study itself, and it is better to finalize what should be the author of authorship and order of the authorship, how it should be there. So that should be specified at the beginning. That should be finalized at the beginning of the protocol stage itself. Who should be the first author, and who should be the second author, and who should be the corresponding author. The order of authorship, it is better to be finalized at the protocol stage only, so that when the study is over, when the study is sent for the publication, so there won't be any misunderstanding between the research team. So it is especially true when you are planning to have a multi-site study, or the studies involving many states, study involving many medical colleges. At that time, it should be better to clarify at the beginning of the study itself, at the protocol stage itself, who will be the first author and who will be the corresponding author. The CV should provide description of the qualification and expertise, training, degrees, and the scientific publication. So if you're sending any publication related to a particular area, the research team, usually when you're sending for article or when you're sending a proposal for funding agencies in relation to a particular specified field, like diabetes, hypertension, or HIV field. So usually the review team, they will go through the CV of the investigators, whether they have done any research on that particular aspect or that particular field of medicine. So if they have done extensive research, and if they have got a strong authority on that particular subject, then the chance of getting the proposal acceptance and getting the fund from the funding agencies, it will be easy. So you have to have a proper research team. So when you are sending a particular publication, particular proposal on HIV, you should have a member in your research team who has done extensive research in the HIV field. So that is better way of having a proper team and having a good resource person in your research team, so that chance of acceptance of your proposal will be better when compared to other research proposal. So budget is very important. As I said, each item when you're sending, it may not be applicable when you're sending for thesis protocol for your PG dissertation, but when you are sending it for funding agencies after CV, you have to write the budget. Each item of the expenditure should be specified. Expenditure should, to the extent possible, should be given in the units time, and a written budget justification is usually required for if the study has any external sponsors. So this is one example I show you how we have the um, okay, so I'll show at the end maybe the how the ICMR when we have budgeted for our cluster randomized stress control trial. So there is a specific format given by ICMR. There is something called recurring expenditures, non-recurring expenditure for the manpower, for the training, for the networking and communication, for the institution overhead charge. All those things has to be clearly specified. How much unit, how much amount is required for 1 year if you are planning to have a 3-year or a 4-year project. What is the unit expenditure for each year? That has to be clearly specified in your budget. And at the end of your project proposal, you have to write the references. So usually we will use the Vancouver style. So where it can vary from one journal to another journal or from one funding agency to another agency. So I think Vancouver, if you write in the referencing, so that is more than sufficient. And appropriate references has to be quoted accordingly when you are writing the introduction, methodology, or in the review of literature. So don't forget to cite the references from which the information or the scientific knowledge has borrowed from the published article. You have to quote the references, otherwise it will amount to plagiarism. So once your protocol is ready, please turn it for, or please send the protocol report for the plagiarism check. There are so many softwares are available, Turnitin, Authenticate, all those softwares are available. So you, depending upon your institutional subscription, so you can send your protocol for plagiarism check, and there should be a very minimal similarity index or the plagiarism, the content. If you have got a lot of plagiarized content, then you have to paraphrase it properly and quote the references properly, so that then it can be sent to funding agencies. Because as a first quality check, they will also check it for plagiarism. Most of the reputed funding agencies, if they found that if you are having around 60% or 70% of the similarity index of the plagiarized material, without looking into your protocol, straight away they can reject that. And this is one of the example of scientific misconduct also. There are ethical issues involved, scientific misconduct. The college or the funding agency can take appropriate action for using the or for having the plagiarized material in your protocol. So be careful about that. Previously, the people are not bothered that much about the plagiarized or the checking for the plagiarism using the various software. Now, as a preliminary step, each journal as well as most of the funding agencies, they will check for plagiarism, and it is better to run it at ourselves only, and we will be very sure that the entire protocol doesn't have any plagiarized material, and even if it is there, it can be paraphrased properly, and then it can be sent to funding agencies. So this is about the few elements, whatever we have discussed, like in a summary chart, I have put it in this slide: research question, significance, or the introduction, design, subjects, variables, statistical issues, all those things you can address in your protocol. So this is just a summary of the whatever we have discussed so far, from the title to the references. Okay, there are last few slides regarding the standard guidelines to be looked into whenever you are preparing a protocol. So I think you can log into this website, equatornetwork.org. So it is a consortium of the researchers across the globe. So they have compiled all the guidelines, and they have given the checklist for each of the study design. You can see here for the randomized trials, for the observation studies, for the systematic reviews, for the study protocol, for everything they have given the different guidelines or different checklists for that. So whenever you are writing a report or whenever you are writing a protocol, make sure whether you have addressed to the checklist given by them. So for example, if you see the study protocol, there is something called SPIRIT protocol and there is something called PRISMA-P protocol. So SPIRIT statement, it is mainly for the clinical trials. Whenever you are planning to have a randomized control trial or the clinical trials using vaccine trial or drug trial, you can go into the SPIRIT 2013 checklist. That is the latest one. So it has got around 33 components. So everything they have mentioned, whether you have done allocation concealment or whether you have done random generation. So each component of your entire protocol, introduction, blinding, all those things is there in that 33 checklist. And ideally you should write from your protocol which line corresponds to that particular checklist. So whenever you are sending a protocol for publication, usually you have to attach this annexure also, SPIRIT 2013 checklist for the clinical trials, and they have got around 33 elements or the 33 items. For each items from your protocol, which line corresponds to that item, so that you have to specify. So similarly for the protocol of systematic review. So if you have written any systematic review protocol, so there is something called Prisma P 2015 statement. Prisma is the statement for reporting the systematic review. After conducting systematic review, then that can be reported using the Prisma 2020 guidelines. So this is exclusively meant for the protocol Prisma P 2015 statement. It has got around 17 items. So you have to see from your protocol, how are you going to do the search strategy? How are you going to do the title and abstract screening? How are you going to do the data extraction? Are you going to do the meta-analysis or not? What software you're using? All those components are there in the Prisma P 2015 checklist. Around 17 items are there that you have to look into whenever you are writing a protocol. So these are the two protocol specific guidelines given by the equator.org, and there are other guidelines like for the reporting the trial, like Consort you have, Strobe you have, Spirit you have, and for the case report you have CARE, and there are so many other reporting guidelines are there for finally reporting the final results. So this Spirit and Prisma P is exclusively meant for writing a protocol. So now the latest thing, not the latest, from the last 10 years it is there. So registration of the protocol. So if you are planning to do any clinical trial, you have to register this trial in the Clinical Trial Registry of India. So it is mandatory now. All the drug trial, all the vaccine trial, as mandated by DCGI, you have to register prospectively. Before the first subject is enrolled into your study, you have to register your clinical trial protocol, no matter whether it is a funded research protocol or your thesis protocol. Remember, even if your thesis protocol has to be registered in Clinical Trial Registry of India, it is simple. You have to log in. CTRI is a website. Go logged into, create an account, and you can upload your protocol. They have got various sections. Who is your study participants, whether you have got an ethical committee, what is the title, abstract, keywords, all those things are there, timeline of your study. So everything has to be fulfilled properly. So previously they used to allow, even if the trial is over, retrospectively you could register, but now it is not required. Now it is not facilitated. You have to register all the clinical trials prospectively in the CTRI website before enrolling the first subject into your clinical trial. So this has been made mandate, and even if the ethics committee doesn't ask, when you are sending it for publication, most of the journal, they will ask whether you have registered your protocol into Clinical Trial Registry of India or not. So yeah, this is one example. So we have recently published one cluster randomized control trial in Journal of Indian Pediatrics. So they have asked, you can see here at the end of abstract, they have asked about this trial registration. So it is one of the initial step only. Whenever you are uploading a your manuscript to this journal, the most of the reputed journals, they will ask, what is your CTRI registration number? If you don't give CTRI registration, then you cannot submit your manuscript. You have to leave that journal. You have to look for some other journal. Most of the reputed journals, the biomedical journal, they will ask whether your trial has been registered in CTRI or not. Remember that even if it is your thesis protocol, no matter whether it is a vaccine, whether it is a drug, or whether it is in a surgical intervention or procedural intervention or educational intervention or lifestyle intervention or behavioral intervention, any intervention for that matter, you have to register your protocol into a Clinical Trial Registry of India. And similarly, so if you have done any systematic review protocol, so you have to register this protocol, a systematic review protocol, into National Institute of Health for Research. There is something called Prospero website. You can go for that. It is nothing but International Prospective Register of Systematic Review. So you have to register your systematic review protocol into this Prospero website, and you will get after going to the peer review process, you will get the Prospero registration number, and that is important when you are sending a final systematic review findings to a publication. They will find out whether your protocol has been registered in Prospero or not. For remember, for the clinical trial protocol, you can publish it anywhere. It is not considered as a publication. Registering in CTRI or registering your protocol in Prospero is not considered as a publication, but it is like one of the important steps so that it is widely available. All the researchers can look into it, and it is publicly open. Anyone can see what research you are doing. So it will add to your values, or it will give transparency in your research. So these are the two examples which I said. That this is one ICMR sponsored trial where I was the PI regarding the cluster randomized control trial. So we have registered in CTRI and it got published also in the last month in Indian Academy of Pediatrics Journal. And this is another ICMR grant which I got for doing the systematic review on pregnant mother for improving the maternal and neonatal outcome. So that we have recently published or recently registered in the Prospero website. So once the Prospero website is done, and then you can send the protocol or the published or protocol or the final report for any publications. So few of the journals, they will ask whether it is been registered or not, or whether it has been registered in Prospero or not for systematic review. So that's all about the important aspects of your thesis protocol, and what are the other important recommendations or the important the registries as well as the mandatory registration is concerned. So what are the websites and how you can use the various checklists provided by the network.org, and what are the different sites where you can register your protocol about the Prospero and about the CTRI. So this is about the last slide. The research protocol contains all the elements except study results and their discussion. That will also provide the backbone for your ultimate research paper. Remember that. If you see the structure of protocol, it contains all the information except the results and except discussion. It has got all the information. So if you give a lot of time and if you prepare your protocol properly, almost 60% of your thesis writing will be over, because introduction is the same thing. Maybe few important articles in the review of literature you might have to add when you are writing a final thesis report, but most of around 60 to 70% of your work will be over if you give lot of time for writing the protocol, because ultimately you enter final year, at the time of writing the thesis, you need not bother too much about the review of literature and introduction, because you have done thorough groundwork at the time of protocol preparation. Only thing you have to concentrate on writing the discussion, and you have to concentrate on writing the results table. So this is all about the protocol and the elements of the protocol. So I am not saying you regarding, oh, these are the things you have to write it, otherwise they will reject it. No, so you write a proper protocol, and if it is in a proper format, and if you give proper justification for your budget, and if you give a proper timeline, and if you have a proper research question, then getting funding from national and international agencies, no matter whether it is ICMR, SERB or DST or from international agencies, it is not that difficult. So only thing is your protocol should be very specific and methodology should be very strong, and the questions which you are going to address in your protocol, that should be made explicitly clear. Then getting a funding agency or getting the financial approval from the funders, it is somewhat easy. So wish you all the best for your thesis, as well as if you're writing any research proposal. So wish you all the best. And if you've got any clarifications, or if you've got any doubts, you can ask. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. That was wonderful and a very informative lecture on protocol writing. For a civil engineer, the most important document would be the blueprint. So for construction of any building, the blueprint is very essential. For a research scholar to develop a protocol and to construct a particular research article, the main important document would be the protocol development. So you have excellently narrated all the information, and it was very, very practical also. So,
Yes, sir.
thank you very much, sir, once again. And then I will request Professor Dr. Abdul Nair to introduce the second speaker of today's session.
Thank you, sir. Thanks once again. Thank you so lot for giving me an opportunity. I'll thank Department of Community Medicine, Annapurna Medical College, Salem, for giving this opportunity. Thank you, sir. Thank you, Anand.
Welcome, sir. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Mohammed. Good afternoon, one and all. It is my great pleasure to introduce Mrs. Himani, who has done a postgraduate with specialization in biostatistics, having 4.5 years experience in teaching medical students. She has also good knowledge of SPSS, base SAS, and all software studio. She is presently working as lecturer come biostatistician at Kasturba Medical College, Mangalore. She delivered too many lectures for PG students and undergraduate medical students. She has also presented and published over 7 research papers in various national and international journals. She has also attended many workshops and conferences. She has also assisted in taking up statistical consultations for the researchers and medical students of Manipal University. Today, we are all here to listen and learn on SS estimation in biomedical research. I believe that all of us would be very much interested to listen the topic. We welcome you, ma'am.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for the warm welcome, sir. I sincerely thank Annapurna Medical College, Salem, and I thank Dr. Somasundaram, sir, for giving me an opportunity to have a guest talk on sample size estimation. Is the screen visible, sir?
Visible, madam. Your face is not visible.
The topic which I'm going to talk is sample size estimation for biomedical research. Okay. The content of the presentation which I'm talking, why sample size is important, what determines the sample size calculation. If we have a testing of hypothesis, how do we compare with the two means? If we have an independent groups and pair data or a two proportions to be calculated, how do we estimate the sample size calculation? And also when we have a single mean and single proportion, how do we estimate the sample size? Okay, so just when we think of sample size, it's not a magic number. Just like that, we come up with a 100 number or a 50 number or a 40 number. There is a proper scientific method or a technique to calculate the sample size. There is a logic, how do we proceed with the sample size? So how big a sample need to be is a fundamental question whenever you put up a protocol. What is a sample size or how much to be a sample size? Whether the 30 number would be enough or a 100 number would be enough, or whether we will get a significant result with only a 30 sample size. That's usually a question for me always whenever the researchers come to me. So firstly, when we think of the sample size, we need to look into our primary objective and study design. That is the fundamental question or a hypothesis for a sample size. A sample size is basically determined by looking into the primary objective and study design. So who all will be involved in a sample size calculation? There should be a clinician, there should be a statistician involved, as well as the investigators and sponsors. Okay, what is the purpose of sample size calculation basically? So why do we need sample size? Very much important. So if you have a sample size calculated properly, you have a higher chance that your power of your study is maintained, or power for a correct detection of a clinical or a scientific meaningful difference at a given level of significance. So what is this power? Power is basically probability of rejecting a null hypothesis when it is a false statement. When your null hypothesis is a false statement, what is the chance or what is your higher chance of rejecting a false statement? That will be taken care when you have a minimum number calculated. Next concept is like precision. Okay, so precision is like when if you have a minimum number calculated, you have higher precision. Precision means to tell when you estimate the sample size, there is a high chance your confidence interval is narrower. Okay, for example, if you have a prevalence of 10%, if your estimated prevalence is 10% and your sample size is only a 20 number, okay, in such scenario your confidence interval is larger. Okay, so when you have a larger confidence interval, if you perform the experiment any number of time, there is no chance your estimate is within that confidence interval. So if you maintain the moderate number of calculating a sample size, there is a chance or a higher chance of precise estimate. Your confidence interval will be narrower. and there is high chance your population value will be within that confidence interval. Okay, when we talk about the precision, we fix the level of confidence. For example, the standard level of confidence is 95% confidence interval, or a 99%, or a 90%. These three values is almost fixed in all of the protocols. With the proper level of confidence interval, your normal value will be fixed. Okay, when we look into the statistical hypothesis, there is a two scenarios: null hypothesis and research hypothesis. Always null hypothesis stands on a nullity, like no difference in means or no statistical significant difference between the groups. Research hypothesis will always talk there is a difference in means, or there is a statistical significant difference in means. Okay, so just for a sake of like, how do we come up with the sample size calculation? There are few types of error. There might be a scenario where the condition of null hypothesis will be a true statement or also a false statement. And the decision what the researcher can take, whether he can accept the hypothesis or reject the hypothesis. This is very, very important. Okay. So when the null hypothesis is a true statement, if we accept the null hypothesis, then we take up the correct action. Okay. If the null hypothesis is a false statement and we still accept it, then we come up with a type 2 error. Okay. So probability of type 2 error is accepting the null hypothesis when it is a false statement. Also, when the null hypothesis is a true statement, if we reject it, we come up with a type 1 error, which is called alpha, or level of significance. Probability of type 1 error is when the null hypothesis is a true statement, we reject the condition. That is called type 1 error. Okay. So the power basically works with a type 2 error. That is probability of rejecting the null hypothesis when it is a false statement. That is, we keep up the correct decision in our research work. That is, we reject when it is, when the null hypothesis is a false statement, we reject that. So usually power we fix is above 80. This is usually a standard values of Z, that is the, what I was talking about, level of significance. For alpha, the 1%, the Z value is 2.58. For alpha, the 5%, the Z value is 1.96. For alpha, the 10%, the Z value is 1.64. You can also use the Excel function norm/sin value for getting the alpha value. Why sample size is very important, or why do we think the sample size is important? Okay, so we have three reasons, that is scientific reason, economic reason, and ethical reason. So we'll just look into that. For a scientific reason, if we go with a too small sample size, we may fail to detect a clinical important effect. Okay, if we have a smaller sample size, we have less power of a study. We are not very sure whether this will be true when we study the larger population. Okay, with the smaller number, we can't predict there might be a true result when we interpret for a larger population. If we have a too larger sample size, it is one concept in a statistics is that when we have a larger sample size, the normality or the theorem, central limit theorem holds good. When we have larger n, there is a high chance you get a clinical important effect. Larger, I mean the p-value will be a smaller number when you study the larger sample size. So when you study the larger sample size, there is a high chance you have a statistical significant difference, but there might be no clinical importance. You need not unnecessarily expose larger people for your study. So the larger n, it's obvious that you have a small p-value. So you need not go with a higher number unnecessarily. If you can stop your study at the 250 sample size, you need not study 400 people. So economic reason is that too small sample size may be a waste of resources. Again, it might be like you might not get a proper result. You have studied 30 sample size, but you might not get an accurate result. Inability to yield useful results. It's just a waste of time and money if you study a too small number also. And again, studying an oversized study also large money and cost and time and manpower again. Ethical reason is that Too small sample size or an undersized study can expose the subjects to the unnecessary, usually a potential harmful treatments without acquiring any additional knowledge. Okay. So if you study a smaller group, there might be like unnecessarily you are exposing a patient for your study purpose, or studying even they might deny going for a better treatment. Okay, so oversized study also might be like exposing the number of subjects for a harmful treatment, any other purpose. So we have to come up with the moderate number. It's like not using a too small sample size or too large sample size. We need to take care of putting up a minimum number, a moderate number. So studying oversized studies, there might be a lot of side effects also for a patients or a study participants who are involved in the study. Okay, so coming up with the main research question, what is the average hemoglobin level among the HIV patients? Okay, so we are looking into the HIV participants here. We are studying our outcome variable among the primary objective is the hemoglobin level. Okay, so here hemoglobin has a proper unit to measure. It has a certain unit to measure, and the outcome variable is called quantitative data. In such scenario, we think of estimation of mean. Okay, so first scenario I'm coming up with is the estimation of mean. How common is a sleeping distress among Parkinson's medication? Who takes this medication? What is the sleeping distress or a sleeping problem, sleeping disorder among these people? Okay, in such cases, what is the sleeping disorder? What is the proportion of sleeping disorder among someone who takes this medication? So that is the scenario for estimation of proportion or estimation of prevalence. Basically, our outcome variable is a qualitative. Okay, we are measuring a proportion among our study participants. In such cases, we come up with the estimation of proportion. Okay, so what is the treatment A better than the treatment B in a blood pressure reduction? Okay, difference in two means my outcome variable is a quantitative data, blood pressure, which has a proper unit, and have two groups to study. Okay, treatment A versus treatment B, who have a better reduction in a blood pressure. If they've taken a treatment A, whether they have a lesser blood pressure when I'm measuring them for a second time. When treatment B, whether they have a blood pressure reduction when we have measuring them for a second time. So difference in two means. Does the proportion of side effects differs between who have undergone a treatment A versus treatment B? Proportion, when we think of proportion, again, it is a qualitative data. In such scenario, we come up with difference in two proportion. So I'll be talking on estimation of mean, estimation of proportion, difference in two means, and difference of two proportion. These four scenarios I'll try to cover in the sample size calculation. Okay, when we talk about the estimation, we have a mean, proportion, then odds ratio, relative risk. When we think of hypothesis testing, we have comparing two means, comparing two proportion, odds ratio, and relative risk. So points to be carefully considered in a sample size calculation is that what is your study objective, especially what is your primary objective, okay, hypothesis of your interest. What is a study design? Do you have a two groups to study? Do you have a more than two groups to study? That is very important. Number of study groups, okay, 3 or more than 3. What is a primary study endpoint or a primary study outcome variable? From your objectives, you reach up to your outcome variable. So outcome variable should be clearly defined, whether it is a quantitative data or a qualitative data, whether it has a proper unit to measure. What if you have a unit to measure, what is the variance of that unit, all those things. Clinically meaningful difference or a variability in a primary outcome variable. So this is very, very important. I'll be just talking about what is clinically meaningful difference or a variability in a primary outcome variable, okay, with an example. Okay, if we consider this example, a research team wished to carry out a milk feeding trial on a 5-year-old children, where random half of the children are given an extra milk every day for a year. So outcome measure, my primary outcome is increase in height in terms of centimeter after 1 year. So from the information from a reference literature, I have age at children's height gain in a 12 months of this age group, 5-year-old children. Mean is about 3 centimeter and standard deviation of about 3. I mean, mean is about 8 centimeter. and standard deviation of 3 centimeters. This is what I have from a reference literature. And my outcome is increasing height. So main research question is that average height gain is same between the intervention group or a control group. This is my hypothesis of interest. Okay, this is my research question. So the study design is that 5-year-old children, one set of group is given extra milk diet and one more set of people is given normal milk diet. Okay, so outcome measure mean height in terms of centimeter. Okay, so mean is a quantitative data, a continuous data basically. Okay, what is this clinically significant difference? Very much important to understand. How much difference in a mean height between the two groups can be considered clinically acceptable or worth accepting? Okay, whether the 1 centimeter difference in a groups is accepted by the clinicians, or 1.5 centimeter between the groups, or a 0.2 centimeter, or a 0.5 centimeter, that need to be decided by the researcher himself, or it should be by the expert's opinion, or from a reference literature, or he can go up with a pilot study to find out this clinical significant difference, or what we call it as effect size basically. So if we have to prove a small clinical significant difference, we should ready to go for a more sample size. We should take up the larger sample size and prove this very minute small difference. For example, if you want to prove a 0.1 centimeter or a 0.2 centimeter, or even say 0.5 centimeter, you should have a larger sample size. A difference to be a difference must make a difference. Okay, to tell the two groups have increased in a height, or a one group is better than the another group, you have to go with a larger sample size or a more subjects. So there is no gold rule for fixing this clinical significant difference. It should be based on both statistical and clinical reasoning. Okay, sometimes taking D from a reference literature or from our earlier trials, it might be misleading. Okay, we'll have to look into the inclusion exclusion criteria and proper methodology section from a reference literature, so that we can compare the D for our study and take or calculate from our study. Okay, so degree of certainty, like if you have to come up with a more power of your study, then you have to ready to go for a more subjects or a more study participants are very important. If you have planning to reduce your type 1 error, okay, probability of rejecting the false null hypothesis, then you have to have a less alpha value. If you want to have a less alpha, you have to go with a more subject. Again, measure of variation, more variability. You have to prove the more variability between the two groups, then you have to go with a larger sample size. Okay. So when I was talking about the milk trial, I will have to go with the comparison of two means. Okay, like I'm going to compare the variability of someone who take a normal milk diet and someone who take a extra milk every day. Okay, usually the children are given a 1 cup of milk. If for my trial, or a researcher is interested in doing the trial and he is adopting to give a 2 cup of milk every day, that is extra milk diet. Okay, what is the variability between a normal children and the extra milk consuming children? What is the variability? So basically, I have to adopt the sample size comparison of minus beta, you are putting up your power value. Okay, so power is 80% or 85%, 90%, 99%, you can fix. So this power and Z value depends upon the value which I've already shown, that is the Z value. Basically, I have already projected the values of Zs. Okay, it is usually 1.96, 2.58, depending upon what power you fix and what level of significance value you take. So this first scenario coming up with comparison of two means when you have outcome variable as a quantitative data and you want to compare it between the two groups. Okay, this is just a calculation. If you have a power as 80% and level of significance as 0.0, alpha value as 5%, if your measure of variation, that is standard deviation, is 2, then how can you estimate the sample size using a comparison of two means? Okay, so each group, that is 250, minimum sample size in each group is 251. Okay, so 251, 251, total is 502. Okay. So when we have a problem statement like this, osteopenia, that is decreased in a bone mass, is most commonly developed in a postmenopausal woman. Okay. So what researcher team is interested in investigating the effect of test drug on increasing the bone density among the postmenopausal women with the osteopenia. Okay, so objective is to see whether there is a significant increase in the average bone density at the distal forearm among the most postmenopausal women in the age group of 55 to 65 years. So their bone density is measured before they undergo any treatment or before the drug is prescribed for them. Okay, their bone density is measured, and for a one year we ask them to take a drug for a 1 year and see whether there is increase or whether the average bone density is increased or not. Okay, so that is the investigation. Okay, in such scenario where the pre-measurement and post-measurement is there. Okay, before 1 year we measure the bone density, and after 1 year again we measure the bone density after undergoing some intervention or some treatment. Okay, whether we want to see whether the bone density is increased or not after 1 year of follow-up. The same set of people or same set of subjects who are measured before at the baseline and followed up for a 1 year and measured again. In such scenario, we call it as paired t-test. Okay, sample size estimation for paired data, a paired information basically. So we have the sample size calculation for a paired t-test. We have a common standard deviation. What is the average standard deviation at the baseline level, and what is the average standard deviation after we follow for them for a 1 year? What is a common standard deviation we have to estimate? Okay, variance of pre-test value and variance of the post-test value. What is a common clinical significant difference? Okay, like a 2 unit of difference or a 5 unit of difference. Using that, we come up with a paired t-test calculation. Okay, so we have looked into comparison of two means and comparison of or a paired t-test, comparison of paired data, pre-test values and the post-test values. Okay, now we are looking into comparison of proportion. Okay, to see whether there is a significant difference in the percentage of breast cancer patients survived after the 5 years of diagnosis between a new treatment versus the standard treatment. Okay, so outcome measure is percentage of survived. Okay, the design we have breast cancer patient with a new treatment versus standard treatment. Okay, what is the proportion of patients surviving with the breast cancer, a new treatment versus percentage of people surviving in a standard treatment? So I have here the two groups, that is new treatment versus standard treatment, and I'm looking into the proportion of survived. So basically I'm coming up with a scenario comparison of two proportions. So the percentage of people who survived with the standard treatment is 70%, and percentage of people who survive with a new treatment is 75%. If I have a information after I'm done with the study, so I can compare from a reference literature. If I have a information on a new treatment versus the standard treatment, I can go for a comparison of two proportions using the formula n equal to Z1 minus alpha by 2 square root of 2 PQ plus Z1 minus beta into square root of P1 Q1 plus P2 Q2. So P1 stands for the prevalence of a percentage of a first group, that is the proportion of breast cancer cured or survived among the new treatment. P2 stands for the proportion of breast cancer cured or survived among the second group. Okay, so Q is 1 minus P, Q1 is 1 minus P1, and Q2 is 1 minus P2. Okay, so proportion 1 and proportion 2 need to be estimated from the reference literature or from a pilot study, or even usually I adopt when I calculate the sample size from a reference literature. We take out this P1 and P2. Okay, for example, if the proportion of in a first group in a standard treatment, if it is 0.7, and the proportion of the second group with the new treatment, it is 0.75, then we can use the sample size calculation for a 2 proportion and calculate the sample size. Okay, so each group need to have 1251 sample size. The minimum size of a sample in each group is 1251. So all the formula you estimate will be for the particular group. You have to double the sample size when you have 2 groups. Okay, so now we are coming up with to determine the mean hemoglobin level among the HIV patients. So this is one first example which I put up, that is estimation of mean. Okay, the summary measure or the outcome variable here I'm looking is hemoglobin level. Okay, so outcome variable is quantitative. I don't have any groups here to compare. So if I have to study among the HIV patient the mean hemoglobin level, I would go with estimation of mean formula. That is very simple. N equal to Z1 minus alpha by 2 sigma upon D the whole square. When we have estimation of mean, we go with the standard deviation formula. That is, the numerator will have a sigma. That is anticipated standard deviation of the population, which is taken from a reference literature. What is the anticipated standard deviation of the population? D is the again margin of error or a clinical significant difference or effect size. What is the error rate? You can acceptable error in a true population. Z is a standard normal value or a with a specified level of significance, a standard normal value of Z is taken for a computation. If we look into this example of mean hemoglobin level, the margin of error is D equal to 1% here, that is with a 95% confidence interval. If the sigma is equal to 5.5 from a previous study or from a pilot study, if you get a sigma standard deviation as 5.5, we can estimate the sample size. Okay, substituting in a formula 1.96 into 5.5 upon 1 the whole square, which gives 117 is my minimum number of HIV patients required for the study is 117. So this is with estimation of mean, single mean. Next is looking into the scenario of estimation of proportion. Okay, so determine the prevalence of cholera in a rural population. Okay, that is a proportion of cholera in a rural population. So it is proportion, which we are looking is qualitative data, prevalence basically. In such scenario, we go with estimation of proportion. In estimation of proportion, we have absolute precision and relative precision basically. So absolute precision is when you don't have any loss to follow-up or a non-response error rate or mean to tell missing data or a missing value in a system, or you distribute the questionnaire and there might be a non-response error rate also. Some might not end up giving back the questionnaire. In such cases, you can go with a relative precision. A formula for relative precision is N equal to Z square 1 minus alpha by 2 P into 1 minus P upon epsilon P the whole square, where epsilon stands for an error rate of error percent of P. Okay, when there is high chance when we have a loss to follow-up missing data, we can estimate using a relative precision. Nor else when we are very sure our population will return us the questionnaire, or we are very sure we are studying a sample who will be giving us the proper information for our study, then we can go with the absolute precision N equal to Z square P into 1 minus P upon D the whole square. So here the proportion of event in the population should be taken from the reference literature or from a pilot study. The prevalence or a proportion of event need to be known for us. In an estimation of mean, we need to know the anticipated standard deviation. In estimation of proportion, we look into the proportion of event in the population. So Z is again a fixed value, 1.96. Okay, it can change if you are changing out the level of significance, it keeps varying. Okay, so when you have a lot of non-response rate or attrition rate, you can even adjust your sample size. You can increase your sample size little more by N1 upon 1 minus NR. Okay, what is the proportion of non-response error rate in the population? That you can keep and calculate the sample size N2. Okay, this is the original sample size which you have calculated. including a non-response error rate, attrition rate. If you include, you come up with a new sample size, which creates the adjustment for a sample size for a non-response rate. Usually in a community-based study, if there is a high chance of non-response rate, we can include this. Okay. For a study to perform, to have any good sample size, we need to look into the availability of our resources, basically a finance, a material, a manpower, a logistic support, a time and ethical consideration. If we study 250, is it feasible to cover them, or is it necessary to come up with this 250 sample size? If we can prove out with the 150, a larger difference can be proved out with a 150 sample size. We unnecessarily need not take a 250 number. Okay, so looking into all the logistics, we can come up with a moderate number. Okay, so basically how large the sample need to be, it depends upon primary study outcome variable and the summary measure. Okay, then the statistical study design, the epidemiological study design, what kind of study design you're going, whether a case control or a cross-sectional or a cohort study, whether you have more than 2 groups or more than 3 groups, what kind of statistical procedure or statistical analysis you want to do. And you should carefully look into clinical significant difference and the level of confidence, power of your study need to be maintained, and other constraints also. Few of the softwares to calculate sample size. So we have this Nmaster, GPower, and OpenEpi softwares to calculate the sample size. So this is how the Nmaster software looks. You have a lot of options, like here a proportion, comparison of proportion, comparison of means. If you have the standard deviation or a proportion, you can give your fixed level and estimate your sample size. Okay, all the softwares are automatic. If you feed them with the proper values, it will automatically generate the number. This is basically a GPower. For an Nmaster, you need to have a proper prevalence and standard deviation or a level of significance, confidence interval, confidence level. Everything need to be fed. Okay, whereas for a GPower, only with the effect size. If you change the effect size, it will give an variation in a sample size. So this is how the GPower looks. GPower software. So it has more than 2 groups. It have a comparison sample size calculation for an ANOVA, or more than 2 proportions if you want to compare the study. And we have a site that is OpenEpi site also. With the simple proportion, we have to buy matched case control study. We have ANOVA. We have other few more options. With the OpenEpi website, if you click on, you will have a sample size calculator. Okay, preferably we use Nmaster. Okay, it's a standard tool to use this for a sample size calculation. So Nmaster, I would recommend if you want to calculate the sample size. Okay. If not, if Nmaster is not feasible, you can go with a GPower, and you can also try with this OpenEpi sites. Thank you. So any queries?
Great and excellent presentation. I believe that this session will help us in understanding the patient in the laboratory, and it will be very useful for the first world. Thank you much. Now I welcome our Lachmi to chair the session.
Thank you, Dr. Priyadarshini. First of all, I thank for our chairman and vice chairman and the dean, MS and VP and director of academics and the control of examination for giving this opportunity. And also I sincerely thank Dr. Ramesh Phola, professor and Kasturba Medical College, Bangalore, Manipal Academy of Higher Education, Manipal, and Ms. Imani, lecturer from Biostatistician, Family Medicine Department, Kasturba Medical Bangalore, for the immediate acceptance for this program. I sincerely thank for 2 speakers. And Ramesh Phola, he explained about the various building structure of a protocol and he explains about the steps in research and the importance of the introduction, review of literature, objectives, materials and methods, and various data collection methods and data management analysis, and what are the strengths and limitations, and various overall project management, and the reference in various headings, references, study protocol outline, and how to registration of protocol. He explains nicely the importance of it is very useful for our students and PGs and faculties for concern for research scholars. Thank you, sir. And regarding madam, she explains about the what are the various sample size estimation. Regarding this, he explained very well about the type of errors, importance of sample sizes, and what are the. Yes, he also explained about the various points to be carefully considered during sample set estimation, and various various examples for sample size, for example, estimation of mean, estimation of proportions, and as he explained how we can calculate the sample size. And finally, she also what are the softwares used for calculating sample size. She is also explained. Thank you, madam, very much. You are dedicated to speak on this topic on sample size estimation by biomedical research. I sincerely thank for the two speakers, and a few questions to the speakers. So, what are the criteria for study objectives?
Yes, sir. Sir, I think that I have outlined while presenting only. So whenever you are framing a study objectives, so it should be smart. As I said, it should be specific, it should be measurable, and it should be achievable, and it should be realistic, and it should be time bound. So based on the feasibility aspect, you have to take into account the institution, what it is supporting, and depending upon whether it is a thesis or a funding proposal, based on that, time bound has to be, the time duration has to be taken into account while framing the objective. So ideally it should be smart, sir.
Oh, thank you, sir. Next question, what is the purpose of registering your trial in clinical trial registry India, sir?
Okay, this is one of the important questions. So what is the purpose of registering clinical trials? Sir, one thing is it gives value to the researcher. So it is improve the quality and it is open for the public domain. And second one, for all the clinical trials involving drug or vaccine, it is now made mandatory by DCGI. If the trial has to be registered in clinical trial registry of India. And third thing, most of the well-reputed biomedical journals, when it is sending for the publication, they will ask whether the particular trial has been registered in CTIRI or not. If it is not registered in CTIRI, you cannot go ahead with the publication, or you cannot go ahead with the submitting the manuscript for the publication. So these are the three important considerations why you have to do the CTIRI registration. And even the public also can see what is the protocol and what is the sample size, how they are going to recruit the subjects, and whether they have got any adverse events, how they are going to monitor the adverse events. So all those things are very important. Maybe as a researcher, that is also important whenever you are doing a systematic review of a clinical trials. So whenever you are doing the data search or the search strategy, you can look into the CTRI proposal, whether there is any deviation from the proposal from what it has been published in the journal. In the protocol, they have mentioned something, but ultimately when it got published something, so it might be different. So that thing you can point it out and you can write to an author saying that why there is a deviation from the protocol. So all these things are the very important. More importantly, now it is it has to be made mandatory by DCGI. For all the trials, it has to be registered in CTRI, whether it is behavioral intervention, educational intervention, or lifestyle intervention, or drug vaccine trial. Everything, anything involving human subjects or animal involving the clinical trial has to be registered, sir.
Thank you, sir. What is the monitored emergency use of unregistered and investigational interventions, sir?
Okay, so I think this concept was made more popular during the time of Ebola virus infection, because this is WHO has created a ethical protocol for monitored emergency use of unregistered and investigational intervention. That is MEURI. So mainly for those disease for which there is no effective treatment at present, and for which clinical trial cannot be initiated at the earliest, and there is certain evidence are available from the animal experiment or from the in vitro experiment that drug or vaccine is proved to be safe and effective. So those drugs for the emergency purpose, I think we can go ahead with using for the particular public health emergencies like corona pandemic or Ebola virus pandemic. You can use it, but the only concern here is you have to take the informed consent from the recipient, and it should be approved by the respective organization. And I think few drugs, for example, remdesivir, flavirapavir, and other monoclonal antibodies, which they have used during the Ebola virus pandemic, Ebola virus epidemic. At that time, they have used this protocol, monitored emergency use of unregistered and investigational intervention. So same thing has been applied for the coronavirus infection, also the vaccines like Covaxin. It has been made initially used as an emergency use. By taking the consent from the subject, the government has issued a vaccine to the participant.
Thank you, sir. Madam, convenient sampling technique useful for generalization?
Okay, so convenient sampling technique, usually it is a non-probability sampling method. So for a generalization, we would recommend always a probability sampling methods. So convenient sampling, usually when it is like a hospitalized study, we can generalize, but usually a probability sampling, like a simple random sampling or a stratified sampling, is a better estimates to generalize for a whole population.
Okay, madam. The last question, madam. What is the fish bowl technique, madam?
Okay, fish bowl technique or a fish bowl draw, we tell. It is generally like a lottery method. If, for example, in a simple random sampling procedure, we have to pick up the, for example, if we have 1,000 households in an area, how do we take out the 100 households out of 1,000 households? Okay, so for 100 households, we have to put up a chit of all the 1,000 households, and we have to put it in a bowl, and then we take randomly one by one, we take out. So that is an option for the fish bowl technique. One by one, choosing out of 1,000, choosing 100 samples.
Okay, madam. Thank you, madam, for sincere effort and excellent talk on this topic. Both speakers, I sincerely thank once again for both speakers for delivering a lecture for this topic. And I request the audience to may send the questions to the email ID of the speakers for further clarification. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, madam.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Let me welcome Professor Dr. G. Dachekar to propose vote of thanks.
Good afternoon, one and all. Honorable Chairman, the Dean, Medical Superintendent, Vice Principal, Controller of Exams, and our most valued speakers of this evening, and all the registered professionals and students. It is my privilege to have been asked to propose the vote of thanks on this occasion. A big thank you to Dr. Ramesh Palla for his efforts towards structure of a protocol and making the session very informative and interesting. Thank you, sir. And I must mention our deep sense of appreciation to Mrs. Kemani for her explanation on sample size estimation in biomedical research and making the topic very clear to all the participants. Finally, I would like to take this opportunity to thank the management, administration, and the technical team